Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
Good afternoon. My name is Mo Alathi, and I am the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics and Public Service here at Georgetown. And on behalf of Georgetown and the Institute, better known as GU Politics Around Campus, I want to thank you all for coming to this evening's very timely conversation. Our Institute is commemorating our 10th anniversary this year. And over the past decade since we've been around, we have seen quite a bit of disruption in the world: economic disruption, cultural disruption, social disruption, political disruption. And so as we begin exploring our 10th anniversary, or commemorating our 10th anniversary, we are really asking a series of questions all year long about what the future of public service may look like as we continue down this through this era of disruption. What does the future look like? One of the biggest questions about that is, can we get our fiscal house in order? And so when the Peterson Foundation reached out to us, one of the leading nonpartisan organizations dedicated to finding bipartisan solutions to our country's fiscal challenges, and suggested that we have a conversation in partnership with one another, we jumped at the chance. So I want to thank Brett Loper, Kathy Koch, and the entire team at Peterson for your partnership. I also want to thank our parent school, the McCourt School of Public Policy, as well as Columbia University's Institute of Global Politics for their assistance and participation in this program tonight. Our institute is dedicated towards pulling back the curtain on politics, on public service, by putting practitioners and students in rooms together to explore the promise of politics, the promise of public service. Tonight's conversation, I think, is going to be a good example of that. And so what I'd like to do now is invite to the podium to make the introduction of our panel Ethan Resnick, who is a second-year graduate student at the McCourt School of Public Policy. Ethan?
Thank you, Mo. I appreciate that. And good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's conversation, Solving America's Fiscal Challenges, presented by GU Politics in partnership with the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. I'm Ethan Resnick, a second-year Master of Public Policy student at the McCourt School, where I'm a microeconomics teaching assistant and currently completing my capstone project on the economic effects of public health initiatives in India. I grew up in Claremont, California, and I'm currently helping my former congressman on a project to build the Fallen Journalists Memorial here in Washington, D.C. And I currently work here in Washington at Aiken Gump as a trade policy intern, where much of my focus is on strengthening North American economic integration. That's why it's such an honor to introduce our two distinguished speakers who have each shaped U.S. economic policy on the world stage: former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, whose conversation will be moderated by Spring 2025 GU Politics Fellow Meg Kinnard. Mr. Steve Mnuchin served as Secretary of the Treasury during the first Trump administration from 2017 to 2021. Prior to serving in President Trump's cabinet, Secretary Mnuchin was the National Finance Chairman for the Trump campaign and served as senior economic advisor to the president. He played a pivotal role in advancing the administration's economic agenda, strengthening national security by combating economic threats, and managing the U.S. government's finances. In 2002, he founded, chaired, and served as the Chief Executive Officer of Dune Capital Management. Before this, he worked at Goldman Sachs, where he served as a partner and Chief Information Officer. Our other speaker tonight, Mr. Jack Lew, served as Treasury Secretary during President Obama's second term from 2013 to 2017. Previously, he also served in the Obama administration as the White House Chief of Staff, Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, and Director of the Office of Management and Budget, a position he also held during President Clinton's administration, when the U.S. budget operated at a surplus for 3 consecutive years. Secretary Lew started his White House service in the Clinton administration as Special Assistant to the President. In that position, he played a lead role in designing AmeriCorps, the National Service Program, and worked on healthcare reform with then First Lady Hillary Clinton. Secretary Lew is currently a professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. These two leaders' experiences at the highest levels of U.S. economic policy under 2 very different administrations offer invaluable perspectives on global finance, fiscal leadership, and the challenges of governing in the modern era. This evening's conversation will be moderated by Meg Kinnard, who's a national politics reporter for the Associated Press, a spring 2025 geopolitics fellow, and a graduate of the School of Foreign Service class of 2002. Following their conversation with Meg, Secretaries Mnuchin and Lew will be taking questions from students. Remember to join the conversation on social media by tagging @geopolitics. Now, please join me in welcoming former Treasury Secretaries Steve Mnuchin and Jack Lew, and politics reporter Meg Kinnard.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you both for being here. We are planning to have a robust discussion, which will include questions from some of you. And if it's okay, I'd like to just go ahead and dig right into it. You both have different pieces of the story of the Middle East. And given the news that's been evolving over the past day with news of a ceasefire deal, I just wanted to ask you both to reflect on your experiences with this issue and what you make of the news that we've just learned.
Well, I'd say it's obviously an extraordinary time, and we're very pleased with what's going on and have great hope for the region. I had the opportunity to work during the first term on the Abraham Accords. I actually went to see Secretary Lew when he was ambassador in Israel. So, I mean, first let me say, obviously, having all the hostages come back is the single most important issue, and looking for peace in the region, and finally a settlement of this terrible war is obviously a great thing.
I spent 14 months as ambassador during the war there, and the end of the war, the freedom of the hostages can't come soon enough. I think the amount of progress made in the last few weeks has been very dramatic. The agreement in principle, I hope and pray, will bring the hostages home. And then it's going to be a long, difficult process to follow through on that and to have all the details fall into place. I think we're at a moment now where there's a need in almost all quarters for there to be peace. And I think the President has used his unique ability to create a sense of necessity for the parties to take seriously when he says now's the time. And this is going to be very consequential next few days.
Absolutely. Thank you both for sharing your perspective and your experiences on that. Since this, I'm a news reporter and we deal with what's in front of us, and given the import of that issue and what's been developing, they both said that they would like the opportunity to speak about it, and so I'm glad that we did. Thank you. I do want to turn now to issues more germane to the subject of our time together, to America's fiscal health. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is the national debt. It's currently 37.5 trillion, unless I've missed something lately. I know the number does keep going up, but that's currently where it is, rising by a record 1 trillion every 5 months. Servicing that debt costs about 1 trillion annually, and an analysis this year found that rising national debt at current levels will cause significant economic damage, including job and income loss. Given your experiences, I wanted to ask you, are we at the point now, with that debt being so high and the cost of servicing it, that makes it harder to function rather than enabling it to provide services? Secretary Liu, what are your thoughts?
So May, I think we're at a point now where the interest on the debt is about what we spend on our national defense every year. And that means it's having the effect of either forcing you to do less of the things that the American people expect their government to do, or to run a bigger deficit. It's not a surprise, because we've had policies that, either because of policy direction or crisis management, which was also policy direction, led to spending, and other policies that led to revenues, and the difference is deficit. What I don't think we are at yet is the point where it's creating an economic crisis. And you know, my experience going back decades is that the deficit, the debt, don't really become a powerful issue in terms of focusing the attention of government on it until it's having ramifications in the economy. You know, we have an economy that is kind of slowing down but still chugging along. You know, we have a labor market that stayed pretty strong. If anything, we don't have enough workers now, it seems. And I think it's going to take a bit of time before it starts to feel like it's squeezing the economy. I, for one, don't think we should wait for that. I think the moment to deal with the deficit is when you're not in a crisis, when you can take decisions over a longer period of time and have them take effect in 5, 10, 15 years. The choices you have when you're in a crisis are much more difficult. And I'm sure we'll get to it later, dealing with things like Social Security. It's not even 7 years before the Social Security Trust Fund is going to start running into trouble. Well, I can tell you from having worked on Social Security since 1983, when we fixed it for almost 75 years, it'll get to just about 60. The best time to do that is not a month before you have a problem. So the fundamental challenge we have is the things that we need to do as a country cost more than we're willing to pay for in terms of the taxes. And I think we have to have an honest debate in this country about what the right mix of what we think we need and what we're willing to pay for. We can't just keep going on the course we're on.
Secretary Mnuchin, your thoughts?
Well, when I started as Treasury Secretary, the debt to GDP ratio was about 100%, and that's what I focus on. And we were very focused on economic policies where we were growing the economy faster than we were growing expenses to get that ratio coming down, which we were on path to do. Then COVID came along, where there was clearly the need for very large spending, given the economy was shut down. And then in the Biden administration, spending continued. We're now at a point where we have debt to GDP of approximately 125%. I think that's on the high end of comfort for where we are. And I think the easiest way to solve this problem is to have the economy grow faster than expenses. So I think it's you know, we're obviously in a government shutdown over the budget. I think keeping government spending to inflationary increases is something that's really important, and ultimately is going to require bipartisan support on some of these programs like Social Security. But in the short term, I would look for this ratio to come down with the economy growing faster. If the economy doesn't, then it becomes a more difficult process.
We are going to talk more about Social Security and Medicare in a moment, so I'm glad you're both already kind of thinking that way. But One follow-up I wanted to ask are what you foresee the effects of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act having on that debt. What do you think will happen there?
Well, a major part of the tax cuts were really just extending tax cuts that had already existed. So if the tax cuts didn't go through, you were going to have tax hikes, which I think was not the right policy. I think there are other things in the bill, like accelerated depreciation, which are very pro-growth. Obviously, the tariffs are raising a lot of revenue, which is helpful on the deficit. But again, I think we'll have to monitor growth and the debt to GDP ratios.
Secretary Lew?
I guess I take a different view. I think the reason it was, in fact, the case that taxes would go up is that the tax cuts had been enacted with a sunset, that they were going to go away. And I think that's a terrible habit we've gotten into because it hides the out-year costs of what we're doing when we cut taxes or spend money. And it was a predictable thing that it was going to be extended because we don't have a great track record letting the sun set. The sun rarely sets on tax cuts. So it was put into motion to have that effect. I think the overall bill is one that increases the deficit compared to the baseline, that is, if the bill hadn't passed. And it's only because of the tariffs that the overall debt situation isn't deteriorating more rapidly. So I think it is true that the tariffs are bringing in revenue. We'll talk about this more later. I don't think the tariffs are a sustainable source of revenue. And I think we're now in a position where people who think the tariffs are bad policy are reluctant to talk about taking them away because we've become dependent on the revenue to pay for the One Big Beautiful Bill. And I think that's a bad trade because I think it's going to reduce growth. If growth is what we need to get out of the hole we're in, I don't think that's going to get us there. I think there are aspects of the bill that, to me, were particularly troubling, which is tax provisions were added that had the effect of cutting the taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals. Those were paid for by cutting benefits to people who were at the middle and lower end of the income scale. And I think that's the wrong way to make policy. For my 40 years or so making policy, I always look to have a progressive distribution of benefits and taxes, not the reverse. And people can disagree on that, but right now, even in this government shutdown debate, one of the things that's being argued is, should health insurance premiums be allowed to go up as much as they're going to go up? And it's because in that bill, they made some decisions on what would be the level of subsidy for health premiums under the Affordable Care Act. So I think there's a lot of policy issues in that bill that I would have made different choices on, but from a fiscal policy perspective, I think it only took the deficit problem and made it worse.
You're right that we will spend a little bit more time hopefully talking about tariffs. So one thing I want to get to quickly before we do that is Social Security and Medicare. You already mentioned, Secretary Lew, the projected date of 2033 in terms of those funds running out. And as trustee for both trust funds, Secretary of the Treasury plays a role here. And so I wanted to hear from both of you at this point, given that impending timeline, what would you think that the current secretary is thinking about? How is Treasury preparing? What is going on at this point? Not to mention the ongoing political debate that oftentimes creeps into that and can complicate things. But Secretary Mnuchin, what do you think is happening in terms of possible preparation given that short timeline?
Well, when I became Treasury Secretary, and there's a tradition of the previous administration has a whole bunch of briefing material prepared. When I was reading the briefing books and I looked at all the important titles I had, and I was managing trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund, I was really excited that I thought I could have a big impact on this. And then when I realized that it was a big title and the most important thing we did was write this report, The answer is that the Treasury Secretary alone can't fix the Social Security issue. I think the problem needs to be solved with bipartisan support. There's just no other way to do this. And the report, for years now has indicated when the trust funds are going to run out of money. So this is something that factually has been reported for, and the date is just becoming sooner and sooner. Look, I think there is if you look back, well, let me make a comment that in general on government spending, Social Security and health costs are a major component of government expenses. And if you want to solve government spending, you can't focus on what's called the discretionary budget alone that Congress looks at. You have to look at all of the issues. So look, I think healthcare costs have to be looked at. It's a huge part of government spending, as does Social Security. Look, one of the interesting questions is how should the Social Security trust funds be invested? Right now we put them in Treasury securities, which are non-marketable securities. But although it's a trust fund, effectively what's happened is it's not really a trust fund. It's just part of overall government spending. When the program was started, the idea was it would be self-funded, and it would be funded by workers, and by the time they paid in, there'd be enough money to pay their benefits. That obviously hasn't worked for a long period of time.
Secretary Lew?
Well, I agree with Stephen that it has to be addressed on a bipartisan basis, and we haven't managed to do that since 1983. I was working at the time for the Speaker of the House, Speaker O'Neill, and it was an indirect but a real negotiation between the leader of the Democrats on the Hill, Speaker O'Neill, and the President, Ronald Reagan. And we, through trusted intermediaries, explored different ideas. There was a commission set up that was the mechanism through which those ideas were vetted. And in the end, there was a conversation between people who trusted each other in our two camps that were political opposites that said, we can both live with this. And there were hard things in the 1983 Social Security reforms. There were tax increases and there were benefit cuts. They weren't devastating. They were paced over a long period of time, but they were very controversial. And it took a long time to develop trust that those issues would not be used by either side as a weapon against the other side. I would say it took a year and a half to develop that ability to even have a conversation. So 7 years to me doesn't sound like a very long time, and I don't see a lot of conversation, and I certainly don't see a lot of trust. So I think the first thing I would do if I were in a situation now would be to try to have back-channel relationships develop where people can talk about these things. And if it means talking through intermediaries, find trusted intermediaries. But there's not going to be a magic solution. I don't think investing the Social Security Trust Fund in equities is a particularly good idea myself. But even if you did, it wouldn't solve the problem in any short order. And it could go the wrong way because markets go up and markets go down. I actually worry more that there would be political interference in what you could and couldn't invest in, and that would skew the likely return on investments in the wrong direction. Because if you look at the way states manage pension funds, that's what you see, and I think that's what you would see if it were at a federal level also. What happens when the Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money is not that you stop paying benefits. You just pay benefits as much as the current revenue will fund. That would mean like a 25% benefit cut for people. And that wouldn't affect people at the top end of the income scale who have big 401ks or a lot of savings and investments, but it would be brutal for people who have meager savings, and most Americans have fairly small savings, and who were expecting a full benefit. So I actually think people ought to be talking about this well before it's upon us. And there are people doing some good work on that at some think tanks, and there are people who've joined on some bipartisan proposals to give ideas some lift. But it is hard in an environment where there is trust. It's impossible in an environment where there isn't trust.
Well, hopefully those people who could be working on that are hearing you, and we'll get to work on those conversations. It is just about time for our Q&A to field some questions from the students who are gathered here. While we're getting that in place, just a really quick question that I want to ask both of you. It does involve those tariffs, which may come up in our student questions, but just quickly, in maybe 60 seconds apiece. Obviously, tariffs are bringing in billions at this point, but it's hard to know what that looks like in the longer term. We were just chatting earlier, there are court challenges, there are ongoing negotiations with other countries that might mean that tariff revenue wouldn't be coming because there's a deal in place. So how do those kinds of situations really make it difficult to plan for how much can be counted on in terms of tariff revenue? Secretary Mnuchin, I'll go to you just again as tightly as you can.
Sure. Well, I would say President Trump has been determined for a long period of time to rebalance trading relationships and make trade more fair trade. So when we say we've had free trade, we haven't had free and fair trade. Our markets have been open. A lot of other markets have been closed, China being the clear example where it's very hard for U.S. businesses to do business in China. And if China opened up their market, it would be an enormous opportunity given that, their middle class is hundreds of millions of people. So I think President Trump is using tariffs as a negotiating strategy to rebalance those relationships. And I think they've been very effective in getting people to the table and making commitments that they wouldn't otherwise have committed. What the long-term role, I think there is a reasonable argument that there should be a baseline tariff that stays in place. It's a form of a consumption tax on foreign goods. And if so, that should be put into a tax bill and made permanent. So I think one of the things we do need for the markets is eventual, what is the permanent state of this?
Mm-hmm. Secretary Lew?
Well, just as a matter of arithmetic, if Stephen is correct, and I think I have no reason to doubt that it's correct, that it's a negotiating tactic, it cannot also be a solution to the deficit. Because if you're putting a big tariff in place so that you can take it away when you get a concession, the tariffs will go down.
Right, unless you put in, it's negotiating to get to a baseline level.
Right, but the baseline level would have to be very high in order to equal the revenues from the
It would, but if you had a baseline tariff of 10%, you'd raise significant revenues.
No, I'm not disagreeing with that. But let's make up numbers that you get $400 billion a year from all of the tariffs that are used for negotiating tools. If you end up with 100 or 150 billion of baseline tariff revenues, you have a $250 billion a year gap, which over 10 years is $2.5 trillion. I think that's close to where we are if you think about what the kind of arithmetic of a baseline tariff would be. I don't actually disagree with you that resetting our policy on tariffs is something that was overdue in terms of challenging the trade relationships. I don't think the idea of using huge tariffs as a negotiating tool is in the long-term interest of the United States. I think it has made us weaker in terms of our ability to be a trusted ally. And I think it kind of ignores the reality that you only control 1/2 of those decisions. The other party gets a vote too. So China can say, we're not going to sell rare earths to the United States. China can say, we won't buy soybeans from the United States. Well, I don't know what the gap in our economy is from soybeans, whether it's $10 billion or $40 billion a year. But if we have to help American farmers to fill that hole, which is what we've done in the past, then your revenues go down. So we're the biggest, most powerful country in the world, but we don't have 100% say. And I don't know how I would have reset the balance given that reality. But I think we're in a place now where it's going to come back to haunt us.
I appreciate both of y'all's answers to that and also your conversation with each other. That's what I love about these events. It's not just me interviewing either of you, it's the conversation space that you can have when you bring people of different backgrounds and points of view together with expertise. So I do appreciate that. Do we have some questions from our student audience out here? We have a microphone set up in the center aisle. So if you would like the opportunity to ask a question, please step up to the mic and let's hear from you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Benny. I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about what you think possible solutions to our entitlement problems, specifically on Social Security. I know there's lots of different proposals kind of on increasing payroll and also potentially decreasing kind of our spendings in terms of potentially increasing the retirement age. So I was curious if both of you guys can talk about what you think your personal opinions for what's the best solution to our Social Security issue.
Well, I think the most important issue is what are you solving for? And I, for one, think we have to protect the current beneficiaries' benefits. They paid in, they expect that. So I think if you make changes to this, it's a little bit of a question of at what point do you make those changes? And as you said, there's a couple of different variables you can play with, but I for one, whatever we did, I'd solve it to make sure, at least for some reasonably predictable time, the current beneficiaries get the current benefits, and that you're changing things for people who are retiring much further in the future.
I very much agree with that principle, and that's exactly what we did in 1983. We put in an increase in the retirement age that is still not fully implemented. The last couple of increments I don't think have actually taken place yet. It was over 40 years that the retirement age was raised, which had the effect of being a reduction in benefits over the lifetime. It's easier to put in revenue measures that take effect more quickly, so you don't have to wait for 40 years to get any benefit to the trust fund. And we have a system that maxes out at an income level that's not as high as it should be in terms of the challenges we have in terms of income distribution in this country, where there's much more of the wage base going to people at the top, and there's income that's not being subjected to the Social Security payroll tax. Now, it does create a little bit of a problem because it means that people at the very top won't, in the end, get their money's worth out of Social Security. I think that is that's an issue, and you have to make sure it doesn't get too out of whack. But if there's concern, as I think there is, that there's unfair income distribution in the country, that's what you pay taxes on, income, and it tends to be in the higher brackets, which is, I think, the way you can build a bridge to whatever you do in the longer term, whether it's on retirement age or the technical adjustments and benefits that people don't see directly, but that have the effect over time of tamping down on spending. It's one of the reasons that I think it's so important to do it not when you're a month or two away. When you're a month or two away, all you have is a kind of hammer, and it's much more painful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I was wondering if Secretary Mnuchin, if you agree with Secretary Liu's assessment that increasing payroll taxes for the more wealthy is something that you agree with.
It's not necessarily something that I agree with, but again, I think you have to look at this in an entirety, and you have to come up with an entire solution. Taxes is one component of it, but people need to sit down, and this ultimately would need legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking today. My name is Vikram. I'm a junior in the School of Business. My question is about political feasibility and just thinking about, for example, Argentina. it seems like the past 4 administrations have all dramatically increased the deficit on stimulus and taxes, and there's no political will ever to either raise taxes or reduce spending. And in Argentina, that led to what was once the richest country in the world becoming one of the poorest. Do you think there's any plausible political path where both parties vote to either reduce spending or raise taxes? And if not, how are we going to avoid becoming the next Argentina?
Well, I don't think our situation in Argentina are at all similar. I mean, we're the largest economy in the world. We're the reserve currency in the world. So I don't think they're at all comparable. You know, I oversaw IMF programs for Argentina. I'm sure Secretary Liu did as well. This issue has been going on. I'm not as involved in their local politics. I know Secretary Bessent is very focused on this and is determined, he said publicly, to provide support for the currency. The government's trying to make reforms, but Argentina's had issues that I don't think are at all similar to ours.
Secretary Liu?
Yeah, I agree that Argentina is not the analogy I would look at for what the United States faces, but I do think that if I understand the real meaning of your question is, do we have to worry that we will get ourselves into a place where we can't manage it and we could lose control of either inflation or our ability to finance our deficit? You know, I think if we don't take the kinds of things we're talking about seriously, the first thing is it'll get more expensive to service our debt. And then at some point, you know, there'll be some unexpected crisis that then triggers, you know, a moment of, you got to fix this. I hope the signals come so that we can deal with it before we have a big crisis. I don't think we end up as Argentina.
That's good to hear. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you so much for this event tonight. My name is Shardul. I'm a sophomore in the College of Arts and Sciences, studying government and economics. I appreciate the point made in the end about rare earths, because that's what I kind of wanted to ask my question about. So today, China introduced new restrictions on the exports of rare earths and related technology, requiring foreign companies to get special approval to export items even containing small amounts of rare earths sourced from China. And then additionally, there was news that in negotiations with India, it's reportedly seeking guarantees that heavy rare earth magnets supplied by it will not be re-exported to the US and will be only used for local needs. So considering that China controls around 70% of rare earths mining and 90% of processing of rare earths, how does the US safeguard its national security and economic interests in trade negotiations with China over tariffs, semiconductors, and access to rare earths? Thank you.
Well, I think, you know, one of the problems as we've expanded global trade is that we didn't have a national security overlay in place. And there were things like CFIUS, which looked at investments, but I think for a long time, we didn't really look at supply chains. You know, I think rare earths is an issue. I know the current administration is facilitating some very significant investments and being very creative with the Department of Defense and contracts to secure that. I mean, to me, the issue that's actually much more problematic is the issue over chips. And, you know, I think our dependence upon Taiwan for chips, and it's, you know, it's a major focus now of how do we bring that capability back to the US. But I think for critical national security issues, you know, we're going through a process which I think is important and it should have started a lot earlier.
I think we're in a difficult situation right now on rare earths. I don't think we have a short-term solution to being dependent on other countries for rare earths. It's not a small thing to develop the resources we have just because of the geological nature of the rare earths that are in the United States. And I think that it showed that there was a lack of thinking through what the other side would do when you put tariffs in place. China's had the ability to use rare earths as a lever against the United States for decades. It was only after they faced punitive tariffs of 100, 200% that they said, what do they need from us? Because we don't want to be in a place where they're hurting us and we don't have something we can use. And they found the rare earth controls as a way to renegotiate the tariffs that had been levied on them. When you look at what was in the renegotiation of the tariffs on China, it actually rolled back some of the semiconductor restrictions that were put in place in the last administration, so that we're now exporting more technology to China in order to roll off some of the punitive tariffs. And as you said, today they put in yet another provision showing that they're keeping the controls on rare earth. I think that the reality is it's a complicated world, and other players in the world are smart and play hard. And when you do things, there will be a reaction. Now, I'm not disagreeing with the notion that getting into a better place of dealing with China on a fair basis is important. I spent 4 years doing it. I think Stephen spent 4 years doing it. I think we made progress. I think you made progress. This was an overshooting the tariff policy, and I think it's coming back to show that they have a considerable amount of leverage. So I think it's going to be a challenge. I think there are other countries that have rare earths. I certainly hope that in addition to having a long-term plan to develop our resources, there's a plan to deal with other countries that we can have alternate sourcing from.
Thank you guys for coming. My name's Akarsh. I'm a freshman in the college studying government. This is a question more specifically tailored for Secretary Liu. You were director of the OMB during the Clinton administration, very successful time for the budget and also for part of Obama administration. And right now we're seeing a director of the OMB who's been Russ Vought, who's been very aggressive with trying to tackle government spending. And we also saw earlier this year the Department of Government Efficiency. I wanted to ask you your take on current, I guess, executive methods of reining back spending. Have they become too politicized? And what would you tell Russ Vought on, I don't know, how to rein the budget?
Until the current director, I was the only person who'd been OMB director twice. So now there are two of us who've gone back there twice. One of the things that you do as OMB director is, in my experience, and I think until very recently, you ask, what are the boundaries of legal authority? Not how far can you push the legal authority and dare the courts to stop you. I think a lot of things they're doing cross the boundaries. And we don't know how the court is going to rule on the substance of most of these things. I think there's been a lot of reaction to procedural rulings from the court that said that lower court rulings were either too broad or premature, but they haven't ruled on the substance. So I don't think we know where the Supreme Court's going to come down on some of the spending power issues, rescission issues. I think the reality is we have a system of government where Article 1 of the Constitution gives the Congress very substantial powers over spending, taxing, and tariffs. And if you want the policy to change, you have to get Congress on a bipartisan basis usually to do it. I think it's bad for our system to try to break that. And I think that what's going on right now is doing some real damage. I think this government shutdown right now is as much over that as anything else. You know, I hear over and over again, you know, leaders, Republican leaders in Congress saying it's the same thing they voted for in March. Well, since March, there have been rescissions. So if you vote to extend the spending levels and then one party unilaterally pulls back some of the money, you know, is it a deal? You know, in my world, a deal is a deal. You make a deal, you stick with it. You don't say, come along and then take away part of it unilaterally. So I think that they'd be well advised to rein back some of this and to deal with the reality that our constitutional system gives Congress very substantial responsibilities here. It was not always the happy thing for an OMB director to have to, I'm looking at you know, my friend Brett Loper, who we sat on opposite sides of the table negotiating this issue. We never said we're just going to do whatever we want. we knew we agreed to things that we found very, difficult in the end. But we didn't unilaterally say we're just going to do it on our own.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. My question is, how does the Bureau of Labor and Statistics influence fiscal policy making, and how could the Trump administration's alleged interference with the Bureau of Labor and Statistics kind of impact that policy making?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with your premise that there's interference. The president has the right to appoint someone. I have no reason to believe that the Bureau isn't going to continue to put out correct statistics. I think the more important issue is how is the economy ultimately doing, and right now the trajectory is quite good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I know there's been a lot of talk about AI recently. I was wondering how both of you felt about the impact of AI capital expenditures on the economy today, seeing as it's driving a lot of growth, but we're also seeing, especially in the VC world, people complaining about crowding out by these pretty interest-insensitive firms towards other forms of investment in the economy.
Look, I think for a young person today, AI is the most extraordinary change, that we're going to see. I mean, I've seen technology changes in my 40-year career, but nothing of the impact of this size and scale. And I think this is one of the places where the United States has an incredible advantage from a technology standpoint. I think the implications of AI are going to be in everything we do, everything from learning to teaching to jobs to military functions to healthcare. I think the opportunities in healthcare, and you talk about how can we potentially get healthcare costs down. So I think there's an enormous opportunity. Now, I will say the amount of CapEx that has been spent and will continue to spend, I mean, the numbers are just staggering. And again, you have 5 or 6 companies that just are generating massive amounts of cash flow. I mean, if you look at the amount of money that NVIDIA is making, unlike when we had tech bubbles and things like that, NVIDIA makes enormous cash flow. They're taking that cash flow and they're putting it back in the AI ecosystem. One of the things we've been very focused on from an investment standpoint is data centers. The issue we're going to have in the U.S. is power for data centers, and I think there's tremendous opportunities for different types of alternative power, including small nuclear reactors and things like that. But I think AI, we're just beginning to see the impact. And unlike the dot-com bubble, there's real cash that's going in, and there's real benefits. I mean, all this CapEx spending is definitely propelling huge parts of the economy.
Yeah, I don't disagree that there's a huge amount of change that's going to happen, and I've never believed that you can stand in the way of technological change. So not in the Industrial Revolution, not when computers came in, and not with AI. What I do think is a problem is it's skewing how we see how the economy is doing and what are the underlying issues that require policy solutions. So if you look at the stock indexes and you pull out the companies that are associated with AI, you see very different performances of how the capital markets are doing. I mean, directionally different, in fact. And you look at what it means for the labor market. I've been worrying in the last few months about this new conventional wisdom that the way companies are going to gain efficiency is that they're not going to be needing to hire as many first-year associates at law firms, first-year associates at accounting firms, the people who take data in a medical office. So I have 2 worries. One is, and this may just be a creature of being a little old, that you learn a lot by doing that stuff. How are young lawyers, accountants, and doctors going to get the experience and judgment if they don't do the things that a computer can do through AI? Will they have the same skill? Will the AI be able to prompt them to know what they need to know to make a judgment. Maybe they will. I worry about that. For the young people who come out, how are they going to get started? What's that going to mean in terms of the shape of the labor market? There is, I think, going to be a need for some policy to think through, what is the shape of the economy of the future? And I don't really know what the answer to that is, but I don't think it's a great solution if we graduate, twice as many lawyers and accountants as we need. Now, maybe the market will work and people won't go to law school and accounting school, but then what will they do? I mean, what will be and it takes a long time for that to work itself out. When you look at the attitudes in this country towards trade, you've totally combined the impact of trade and technology on the labor force in terms of the animosity and anger that comes when you talk about trade. That could be exponentially higher with AI. And it's very damaging to the social structure with where we are on trade.
Thank you.
We have just a few more minutes. Time flies when you're having fun. But let's try to get in at least one or two more student questions. Go ahead.
Hi. So in the past few months, we've had some very weak job numbers. Why do you think that is? And do you think that's a bad omen of what is to come?
I don't see it as a bad omen, and we'll see. I mean, I do think, and we talked about before, AI spending is propelling a huge part of the economy, which has very, very positive impacts, and I don't see that slowing down. And we'll also see, I think, many of the trade policies will have positive impacts on jobs, but something we'll continue to monitor.
The number of jobs you need to just stay steady is a function of how many people are entering the labor force and how many people are leaving their jobs. When I handed over the keys to Stephen, it was in the neighborhood of 150,000 jobs a month you needed. It's probably now 50 to 75,000. So the fact that the number is lower isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think the problem now is that there's a few things going on that, again, are getting mixed up. We have many fewer people coming into the country, and we have people leaving the country because of immigration enforcement policies. And that leads to a situation where the net number of jobs is kind of confusing. What is the result of there being fewer people in those categories, and what is just because people retiring and fewer people entering? And I don't know that we know exactly what the break of that is. In terms of kind of what does it mean to the economy, if there aren't enough construction workers, it's going to make it more expensive to build housing and to build a power plant. I think we have a labor shortage in some of those areas, and I worry about that. I was talking to somebody who runs an insurance company, commercial insurance company, who said every claim they see shows that costs are going up in construction because labor is scarce and it's more expensive. And that doesn't come in the monthly job report. Not having the monthly jobs report makes it harder to answer questions like this that really require dissecting the data and getting additional data.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one final question, so let's see what we got.
Hi. I have a question about Social Security insolvency. So we talked about before, when the trust funds become insolvent, benefits will have to be cut by north of 20%. Recently, there was a proposal out of the American Enterprise Institute that instead of an across-the-board benefit cut, the future administration could maintain benefits at the low end of the spectrum and make up for that with higher cuts at the high end of the benefit spectrum. I wanted to ask...
Take legislation. You couldn't do that by administrative action.
The proposal, which I know is under legal debate, is that the statute didn't specify how the benefit cut had to be administered, and that would give the administration flexibility to choose how to administer it. But if that's something you disagree with, I would love to hear why.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not going to get into the technical answer to that, but what I would say is, technically, the Social Security Trust Fund is a separate trust fund, but from a practical standpoint, it's part of the government budget. So when you say it has to be, benefits have to be cut, that assumes that there's not legislation. My assumption is that there will be legislation at some point between now and we hit that time that we won't have benefit cuts. So I think you do need legislation, but I don't view it as kind of, you know, we're going to hit this wall and people's benefits are going to be cut. I think there's a commitment on both parties not to cut benefits for the current beneficiaries, and this will have to be worked out. It's just a question of when and how.
Thank you.
I mean, as a technical matter, the way benefits are calculated is a complicated formula where there are things called bend points, where the first amount of your earnings history is replaced at a certain rate, and then the rate it's replaced at goes down as you go up. It's a progressive formula. That's set up by legislation. I haven't read the AEI proposal. I don't know how you would go in and do that. In any debate, will be a question of what's the right mix of progressivity in the benefit calculation and progressivity in the tax calculation. And I agree that it's unthinkable that we'll see benefits cut by 25%. My point is that in order to have solutions to that, you can't wait till the last minute.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thank you both so much for being here. That takes us to the end of our hour, which to me has completely flown by. But I really appreciate this time and also such great questions from our Georgetown students here. So thank you all for being participants in this. And thank you once again to GU Politics and the Peter G. Peterson Foundation for hosting this evening's conversation. And sponsors thank Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy and Columbia University's Institute of Global Politics for its participation. And at a time when it seems rare to have this kind of thoughtful, bipartisan conversation in Washington, you both talked about the need to have more of these chats in a lot of your answers. And we don't see that awful lot here in DC. As an alum, particularly, I'm proud that the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service hosts a situation and a conversation very similar to what we saw tonight pretty much every single day. So I'm glad to be part of this. Thank you both for your time, and thank you all for being here. Good night.
Thank you.